With the Emperor Constantine dead in 337 AD, his sons and nephews took over the Roman Empire. Constantine had laid careful plans for succession, but they would not last even a few months. As we'll see in this episode, a summer of blood took the lives of many of Constantine's relatives. And it's a mystery who was behind the purge, but Constantine's sons definitely benefited. And despite the removal of their rivals, the sons were never able to agree and split the empire amicably. How did Constantine's sons divide up their father's empire? How did their suspicions and jealousy play out in the decades after Constantine's death? And what sort of empire was left to the eventual winner? We will talk about those questions and attempt to answer them on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 89, Betrayals and Massacres under the Sons of Constantine. Hey folks, I just wanted to remind you that you can pick up my book, Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World, anywhere books are available. There is a new paperback edition that just recently came out, and if you want, you can get the hardcover or the Kindle edition, or if you like audiobooks, you can also get that too. And if for some reason you're a little short on cash, you can always pick up the book on Hoopla or at your local library, but just check it out. Let me know what you think. All right, let's go ahead and get to today's episode. As we saw in the last episode, Constantine divided the Roman Empire among his three sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and also Constans, and then there were a few extended relatives thrown in there, his nephew Dalmatius, and also his nephew Hannibalianus, who wasn't exactly an heir, but was made king of Pontus, probably as a placeholder for taking over the Persian Empire once Constantine fought and won that war. But unfortunately for Constantine, he died. So essentially, there are 5 people left alive when Constantine died. And the idea was to ensure stability and protect the inheritance of the family at the same time. It was not exactly the same as the tetrarchy, but it was a version of that kind of government where multiple emperors would reign over different regions of the Roman Empire, and in theory, they would all be unified because, well, they're in the same family. Another thing that was common about these guys is that they were all younger, the youngest being in his late teens, the oldest being in his 20s. And they're all thrust into roles when Constantine died that demanded a degree of military experience, diplomacy, administrative skills. These were qualities that, at least our ancient sources suggest, that these brothers lacked. In his New History, for example, the pagan historian Zosimus says that all of these heirs, quote, devoted themselves more to the pleasures of youth than to the service of the state. That's Zosimus's New History, Book 2. In other words, these were young men who would be prone not only to debauchery and decadence, but also perhaps jealousy and suspicion. And what happened after Constantine died is that very quickly, the heirs began eyeing each other with suspicion and looking at the territories that each other had with envy, leading to purges, invasions, and usurpations that immediately fractured Constantine's dynasty and left the empire vulnerable to external foes like the Persians in the east and Germanic tribes in the west. In the last episode, I already broke down who was who, but I'll just briefly re-summarize now. The eldest son was Constantine II. He was the most experienced of the men, and he inherited the western territories of Britain, Gaul, Spain, and his capital was the city of Trier, which is currently in Germany. The Rhine frontier would need his attention, but he benefited from being in the territory that Constantine himself came from and which was most supportive to Constantine. Constantius II then was the middle son. He was given the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, so separated as far away from his older brother as he could be. These are territories like Syria and Egypt, the territories that bordered Persia. Again, that was a region that required an active military presence because of the tensions with Persia, and it was wealthy as well, so a good base for taxation. And the capital city of Antioch was full of veterans and loyal supporters that would help Constantius rule his area. The third and youngest of the brothers was Constans, and he was given the middle section between his two older brothers, so Italy, Africa, and parts of Illyricum, which is roughly equivalent to modern Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia. This was a very difficult assignment because the foreigners that crossed the Danube River tended to pour into this territory, but these were also the heartlands of the Roman Empire, including the city of Rome and the breadbasket of North Africa. Constans would also benefit from the Roman elite there in Rome, so senators and wealthy landowners who were seasoned and could advise him well. That leaves the two nephews. Again, these are Dalmatius. He was given Thrace and Macedonia. Just like Constans, these were a difficult assignment in terms of dealing with invasions. Major trade routes ran through this area, so there was opportunity for wealth and taxes. He and his cousin, Constans, would probably sort of tag team their two respective areas. And then over in the east was Hannibalianus, the other nephew, who was currently set up as king of Pontus and expected to become king of Persia once somebody helped him invade Persia. Presumably that would be Constantius II, who was emperor over the eastern territories. All of this looks great on paper, but Constantine's descendants were not soulless or personalityless people. They were real human beings, subject to paranoia, distrust, and jealousy. And so almost immediately after Constantine died, that is, by summer of 337, there was a great massacre, or what Edward Gibbon called the Summer of Blood. And this was a brutal purge that unfolded between roughly the months of June and August. We know that one of the first people to be killed was Dalmatius, as well as extended family members from the line of Theodora. Theodora, if you'll remember, was the wife of Constantine's father, but she was not Constantine's mother. She was Constantine's stepmother. She and Constantine's father would go on to have many children, including Dalmatius, who was killed, but also many others. And those sons and any of their sons were killed for the most part. Two notable exceptions to the purge were Julian, Theodora's grandson, and his half-brother, Gallus. Julian was only 6 years old at the time, but he would survive and grow up to become a very important person in the Roman Empire, and we will revisit his story in a few episodes. Who orchestrated this purge, we don't really know. Some suggest Constantius II. The boy Julian would later grow up and write letters, some of which we have, and in those letters, he talks a little bit about the massacre, suggesting that at the very least, Constantius II permitted the killings. In addition to the sort of tangled literary sources, we do have some numismatic and archaeological evidence that helps us understand the purge. So there are coins issued in Dalmatius's name in cities far away from the region he ruled, cities like Trier and Constantinople. They were minted as early as May 337, but by the middle of the summer, they are gone. And instead of Dalmatius, coins for the rest of the year show female figures from the Constantine family, like Helena, Constantine's mother. There were also posthumous coins of Constantine, showing him ascending up to heaven, probably as a way to emphasize Constantine himself and, by extension, his direct descendants, that is, the three sons, rather than the cousins who had just been killed. Following the Summer of Blood, the brothers gathered together and divided up the spoils. Constantius took Thrace from Dalmatius's former share. Constans took the rest of Illyricum. He'd only been given part of that province. Poor Constantine II, his territory was all in the west anyway, so he didn't get anything new. And I wonder if he was a little bit upset by this. The reason I wonder is because just a few years later, in 340, Constantine II decided to take territory from his younger brother, Constans. Constantine II, if you might remember, was the eldest son. He was proclaimed Caesar when he was an infant. He had been in power the longest, and maybe he viewed himself as the natural senior Augustus among the brothers. It was, therefore, maybe a slight that he didn't get any extra territory, and maybe he decided to show his sort of paternalistic authority by invading the territory of his younger brother. So from his base in Trier, which was a thriving frontier city on the Rhine with Constantine's palaces, baths, and a mint that churned out coins, proclaiming dynastic unity, by the way, Constantine II decided to leave that base and invade Italy. Constantine II had given some indication that he might do this. Supposedly, he sent some letters to his brother telling him how he ought to run his part of the empire, and I'm sure that the younger brother felt micromanaged. These letters also formed a kind of pretext for the invasion, because Constantine II could say, hey, I've been giving my brother good advice as to how he ought to run things. He's not doing it that way, so clearly that means that he needs some help. And that was the pretext, by the way, that Constans just needed some aid to defend against barbarian incursions coming across the Danube and even potentially the Alps. And that seemed like a good enough justification for Constantine II to take his army into Italy. Once Constantine II had invaded, Constans, who was prepared for this evidently, dispatched several generals with armies to counter the threat. Armies met near the city of Aquileia, which was, if you've listened to previous episodes, a kind of strategic city in northern Italy. It was a port city at the head of the Adriatic. It had strong walls. It was a kind of gateway to the Balkan regions. And during that fight, some of Constans' troops were able to get around Constantine II's army and actually assassinate the emperor. The assassins then threw the body of the emperor into the nearby Alsa River, and then news of the death made its way throughout the empire. This was an obvious betrayal. It was shocking to the empire, and before anybody could react, Constans, who was about 20 years old at this time, swiftly absorbed his brother's territories, that is Gaul, Spain, and Britain, unifying the entire Western Roman Empire under his rule. And he went even farther than that. He posthumously declared his older brother, Constantine II, a public enemy. He annulled any laws that he had promulgated and had his name erased from official records. We actually have some altered inscriptions and some coins which were changed to feature Constans rather than his brother, Constantius II. And if the purge of 337 didn't show it, at this point in 340, it's very clear that Constantine's dynasty was unstable. So Constans, having nearly doubled his territory, now had to figure out what to do with it. He would rule another 10 years, but his reign over the Western Empire was marked by strife internally. There were military revolts. He enacted harsh fiscal policies. His courts were corrupt, and he evidently had many vices that were deemed unsavory in the rapidly Christianizing Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire was large. Constans' father, Constantine the Great, had expropriated a lot of wealth from the region to engage in both wars and building projects. He had imposed heavy taxes to fund the defenses of the Rhine and Danube. And he was not getting much grain from the east, instead having to rely solely on North Africa and Sicily. The historian Zosimus says the following: Constans, having removed his brother, exercised every species of cruelty toward his subjects, exceeding the most intolerable tyranny. He purchased some well-favored barbarians and had others with him as hostages, to whom he gave liberty to harass his subjects as they pleased in order to gratify his vicious disposition. In this manner, he reduced all the nations that were subject to him to extreme misery. That's Zosimus's New History, Book 2. There were also rumors that he engaged in open homosexual relationships. This, of course, was a problem. in the now Christian Roman Empire. And we don't know the extent to which, by the way, all of these allegations were credible, because, as we'll see in a little bit, Constans would not be the last son of Constantine to survive. And anytime a ruler kills another ruler, especially if they're related, in order to justify a deed like that, the winner almost has to claim that the loser was a bad person, a bad ruler, a tyrant, etc., etc. Constans may have been the sort of person that he is described as in the sources, but he very well may not have. We just don't really know. If we stick to just the facts, Constans attempted to protect his region. So in 341 and 342, he campaigned along the Rhine against the Franks, forcing that tribe into a peace treaty and taking tribute from them. He also visited the extremes of his section of the empire. So in January 343, he made a rare imperial visit to the island of Great Britain. He crossed the English Channel in winter with a small escort, maybe about 100 men. The seas were stormy at that time of year. He probably didn't go there on vacation. That is not the best time to travel to the island of Great Britain, but there may have been some unrest or raids from the Saxons or some other kind of tumult in that region. So at this point, there were only two brothers left, Constans and his older brother Constantius II. And they each ruled two distinct halves of the Roman Empire. Maybe they could live out their lives without getting into conflict. But no, the massive religious changes brought about by their father, Constantine, caused division among the brothers. Constans was a Nicene Christian. That is, he affirmed the doctrine of the Trinity as it was spelled out in the Council of Nicaea in 325. Constantius II, however, leaned towards Arianism. And it's probably the case that the populations in each of their territories largely followed the beliefs of their rulers, with Trinitarian Christianity being more popular in the West and Arianism being more popular in parts of the East. A group of bishops from both East and West decided to intervene, holding a council in the city of Sardica, which is the modern city of Sofia, in 343. And it was mostly Western bishops that were at that council, and they used the opportunity to condemn Arianism afresh. In response, the delegation of Eastern bishops withdrew, and there was now a deeper schism than had been before the council. Constans also passed laws banning pagan sacrifices, although he allowed temples to stay open for cultural and civic events. And Constantius II, over in the East, even if he wanted to do something about his brother, didn't really have an opportunity, because after the brothers had killed Hannibalianus, it was up to Constantius II to now manage the eastern frontier with the Persians. And the Persian king, Shapur II, was not a fool. He saw that the brothers were fighting, and he took the opportunity in the 340s to invade Roman territory, besieging the city of Nisibis numerous times. And so Constantius was on the defensive during the 340s, having to fortify or refortify cities, engage in both diplomacy and warfare at the same time, keeping his troops in the east unable to really do anything about his brother in the west. By the year 350, Constans had become deeply unpopular in the west. Despite his efforts to secure his half of the empire and be physically present in its provinces, he could not shake the perception that he was a tyrant. The ongoing economic effects of both his taxes and his father's taxes continued to create economic instability. And if indeed the rumors are true that he was debauched and distracted with pleasures, he may very well have alienated himself from his soldiers. And both Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian, and the historian Zonaras claim that he actually was unable to pay his soldiers. And this is a big no-no in the Roman Empire. So in January of 350 AD, in Gaul, one of Constans' commanders, a man named Magnentius, a man who had risen through the ranks of the soldiers, proclaimed himself emperor in the territory of Constans. He quickly gathered support from disaffected troops, even some administrative officials. He was able to take one of the mints and began minting coins proclaiming the freedom of the Roman Republic, portraying himself as a liberator against a tyrant. Constans was completely caught off guard by this. Supposedly, he was in the south of the province on a hunting trip, and he panicked. He fled towards the Iberian Peninsula, but Magnentius's men were able to hunt him down and kill him by February of 350, somewhere in the Pyrenees Mountains, ending his decade-long rule. Magnentius then seized control of the remaining provinces that Constans had previously controlled, so Gaul, Italy, Spain, Britain, North Africa. He tried to avoid religious fighting within his territory by extending toleration to paganism, which would, of course, have appealed to many of the traditional pagans in the upper classes in Rome and other major cities in the West. Pretty much nobody was offended by sun god worship, and it was pretty easy to connect worship of the sun god with worship of Jesus, especially for these nominal or cultural Christians in the Roman Empire. And then, of course, he had to get the approval of Constantius II. So he sent envoys over to the east proposing that two men divide up the empire, but Constantius was not interested in bringing in a usurper and a man who was not part of the Constantine dynasty. Fortunately for Constantius, he had not killed everyone in the purge. His young cousin Gallus, who by 351 was now about 25 years old, was made Caesar. He was also married off to Constantius's sister, Constantina, in order to bind the two together. And then Constantius assembled a massive army for his cousin, and now brother-in-law, which included both Roman troops and foreigners. Constantius and his cousin then marched west. Magnentius marched east. The two men and their massive armies met on September 28th, 351, at the city of Mursa, which is in modern Croatia. The battle that took place was one of the bloodiest battles in Roman history. Probably over 50,000 soldiers died. It was an infantry battle with formations of troops grinding against each other and then cavalry charges sweeping into the flanks, killing dozens of soldiers each time. In the end, Constantius won that battle, perhaps in no small part because some of his cavalry came from the east. These were Eastern cataphracts, armored horsemen, the closest thing that the ancient world had to tanks. Magnentius didn't die in the battle, and with the few troops that he had, he took flight and was finally chased down in 353, where he committed suicide in the city of Lugdunum, which is modern Lyon in France. And so Constantius II, middle son of Constantine the Great, survivor of all of the purges and civil wars and usurpations, emerged as sole emperor in 353 AD. Already over in the West, he took time to tour the different provinces, not purely on vacation. He made sure to find out who had been loyal to Magnentius and have those people executed, sometimes displaying their bodies or their heads in public. But although Constantius II had won sole control of the Roman Empire, the cost had been very high indeed. All of those dead Roman troops meant that Constantius was not able to garrison all of Rome's borders. Meanwhile, his alliance with Gallus was not going to be strong. Constantius II, after all, had murdered Gallus's father, or at least was suspected to have done this. And then there was also Gallus's younger half-brother, Julian. He too was alive and coming of age. So, with a weakened Roman Empire, Persian and Germanic threats, potential usurpers coming of age, and an empire that was obviously too big for one man to manage, what would happen in the coming years? Would Constantius II be able to shore up authority, or would the empire that he won through treachery and civil war fall into the hands of someone else? We will find out on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.